In the vast silence of the West, character is not forged in the fire of battle, but carved slowly by the quiet, everyday choices between mercy and vengeance. The winter of 1882 locked the Montana Canyon in a fist of ice. Beside the frozen Bighorn River, Eleanor Vance existed in a cabin as cold as her heart. A year ago, dysentery had stolen her geologist husband, a man who saw futures in these unforgiving stones. A month later, it took their daughter. While other settlers fled south, her stubborn Scots blood refused to abandon the soil that held her family. She was a ghost haunting her own life, a silent testament to the land's cruelty. Her mornings were a ritual of survival, a defiance against the crushing silence. This land had taken everything. She would not let it take her too. Silence in the high country was a physical weight. It pressed down from the vast, indifferent sky and rose from the snow-choked earth. Eleanor, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, felt its pressure as she stepped onto her porch. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. The familiar ache of loss was a constant companion, a dull throb beneath her ribs. She moved with the economy of someone who has no energy to waste. Her world shrunk to the necessities of fire, food, and memory. The stillness was absolute, profound, a world holding its breath before a storm. It was a quiet that felt ancient and eternal, a peace that was anything but peaceful. Then, a sound tore through the quiet. It was not the cry of a wolf or the scream of a cougar. It was human. A raw, desperate plea that echoed off the canyon walls and struck her with the force of a physical blow. Terror, sharp and pure, sliced through the fog of her grief. Every instinct, honed by a year of solitude and sorrow, screamed at her to bar the door and ignore it. This land offered no charity, only harsh lessons. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a life fraying at its edge. She could not ignore it. It was the sound of someone else's world ending. Her Winchester rifle felt like a familiar extension of her arm. She moved without conscious thought, her boots sinking deep into the powdery snow. The cold was a vicious predator, biting at any exposed skin. Each step was a struggle, a battle against the landscape that had become her jailer. She did not know what she would find. A prospector caught in a trap, a traveler lost in the blizzard. The possibilities were all grim. As she neared the riverbank, the air grew thick with a sense of finality. She paused, her breath a white plume in the frigid air, steeling herself for what lay ahead. At the river's edge, the sight stole her breath. A young Cheyenne warrior, no older than 20, was fighting a losing battle in the dark, churning water where the ice had given way. His horse stood on the far bank, a frantic silhouette against the snow. Eleanor's mind screamed a litany of warnings. He was Cheyenne, an enemy. The stories told in settlements were of raids and violence. To help him was madness. To turn away was to let a man die. For a long, frozen moment, she was paralyzed, caught between the prejudice of her world and the undeniable truth of his struggle. She saw past the warrior's paint and the enemy's face. She saw the terror in his dark eyes, the desperate fight for one more breath. He was not a concept, not a story told around a fire. He was a man drowning. In that instant, something broke inside her, a dam of grief and fear giving way to a fierce protective instinct she thought had died with her daughter. She would not stand by and watch another life be extinguished by this merciless land. She scanned the tree line, her mind racing. A long, sturdy branch from a fallen cottonwood lay half buried in the snow. It would have to do. "Do not fight the current!" The words left her lips in a raw shout, carried across the deadly gap by the wind. He probably did not understand English, but he understood the desperate urgency in her tone. She crawled onto the treacherous ice, the surface groaning ominously beneath her weight. She extended the branch, her arms trembling from cold and exertion. His eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and hope, locked onto hers. In that gaze, two worlds collided. A grieving widow and a dying warrior, suspended in a moment of shared humanity, their enmity erased by the primal threat of death. His numb fingers closed around the wood. Eleanor pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed, her muscles screaming in protest. The ice cracked, a spiderweb of doom spreading from where she lay. "Come on," she grunted, digging her heels in. For a terrible second, she thought they would both be lost to the river's icy embrace. Then, with a final desperate heave, she dragged him onto the solid ice. He collapsed, a waterlogged heap, his body already succumbing to the killing cold. They lay there, gasping for air, two enemies bound by an act that defied all logic and reason. There was no time for thought, only action. The warrior was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin a deathly shade of blue. Hypothermia would claim him in minutes. Eleanor summoned a strength she did not know she had. Half carrying, half dragging him, she fought her way back through the deep snow to the relative sanctuary of her cabin. The journey was a blur of burning lungs and screaming muscles. She kicked the door open and pulled him inside, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floor beside him. The first part of the battle was over. The second had just begun. He was safe from the river, but not yet safe from death. She worked with a frantic, focused energy. The fire roared to life, devouring the wood she had stacked. She stripped away his frozen buckskins and leggings, her movements clinical and detached, driven by the sole purpose of saving him. She wrapped him in every blanket and quilt she owned, piling them high until he was cocooned in a mound of wool and cotton. For hours she sat by his side, a sentinel against the encroaching cold. She brewed a thin, hot broth, carefully forcing spoonfuls between his chattering teeth. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire and his ragged breaths. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear and intelligent. He stared at the log ceiling, then at the blazing fire, and finally at the white woman watching him with weary concern. He sat up slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his side for a weapon that was not there. "Easy," Eleanor said softly, her voice raspy. "You are safe here." He studied her, his gaze intense, searching. There was no hostility in his eyes, only a profound confusion. Why would an enemy save his life? This act defied the brutal logic of their warring worlds. It was a question that hung in the air between them. Through gestures and a few shared words of broken English, they began to communicate. He touched his chest. "Cheyenne," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My father is Chief Blackhawk." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. She had not just saved a warrior, she had saved the son of a chief. Later, as they shared a meal of dried venison, a tentative trust began to form in the warm glow of the firelight. For the first time in a year, Eleanor felt a flicker of something other than grief, a fragile human connection in the heart of a desolate wilderness. Dawn broke, painting the snow in shades of gray and rose. The calm was shattered by the thunder of hooves. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She peered through the small window and saw a sight that froze her blood. At least 30 Cheyenne warriors on horseback formed a silent, menacing circle around her small cabin. Their faces were grim, their weapons held ready. They were not a hunting party. They were a war party, and she was at their center. The fragile peace of the last few hours evaporated, replaced by a primal, suffocating fear. She had invited the wolf into her home. At their head sat a man who radiated an aura of absolute authority. His face was a mask of weathered granite, and a magnificent war bonnet of hawk feathers adorned his head. This had to be Chief Blackhawk. His presence was overwhelming, a force of nature as powerful and untamed as the land itself. The warriors sat motionless on their ponies, their dark eyes fixed on her door, their patience that of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The silence was more terrifying than any war cry. It was the silence of judgment, of a verdict about to be rendered. The cabin door opened, and Cheyenne stepped out. He moved slowly, his hands held open to show he was unarmed. He spoke to his father in the rapid, flowing cadence of the Cheyenne language. His words were urgent, his gestures pointing from Eleanor to the cabin, then to the river. The chief listened without expression, his gaze never leaving the small log structure. A few other warriors murmured amongst themselves, their voices low and guttural. Eleanor watched, trapped, a spectator in a drama where her life hung in the balance, the script written in a language she could not understand. Finally, the chief dismounted. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his age and approached the porch where Eleanor stood trembling. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to look straight through her, weighing and measuring her soul. "You saved my son," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "It was not a question. I thank you." He paused, his gaze hardening slightly. "But I must ask, why was my heir, my only son, found half dead in the river, so far from our winter camp and alone?" The question was a spear point, demanding a truth she did not have. "A life debt is a sacred thing," Black Hawk declared, his voice resonating with ancient authority. "My son lives because of you. My people do not forget such things." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object wrapped in deerskin. He unwrapped it to reveal a pendant, exquisitely carved from bone into the shape of a soaring falcon. "This was my grandmother's," he explained, placing it in her trembling hands. "She was a peacemaker. You have the same spirit, I think." He then proclaimed that she was now under the protection of his tribe. A sacred bond was forged. But the chief's face was still troubled. He looked past her, toward the distant mountains. "My son was on a desperate mission," he admitted, his voice low. "There is a new settlement in the valley to the south. Providence Gulch. A white man named Bartholomew Kane is building a dam on the creek. It is the only source of water for our people and our horses in the deep winter. He is choking the life from us." The weight of his words settled upon Eleanor. This was not just about a dam, it was about survival. A slow, deliberate act of war disguised as progress. "My young warriors have hot blood," the chief continued, his gaze returning to Eleanor. "They see only one path, the war path. They cry for vengeance against the men who would see our children thirst. But I am old. I have seen too much blood soak this land. War is a fire that consumes everything, even the victors." He looked at the falcon amulet in her hand, then back at her face. "You showed my son compassion when he was your enemy. You did not see a Cheyenne. You saw a man. Perhaps these settlers will listen to a voice like yours." "I ask you to do the impossible," Black Hawk said, the full weight of his request settling upon her. "Go to this Providence Gulch, speak to these people, make them understand what they are doing. Cheyenne will guide you. He will be your voice to me." It was not a command, but a plea from a desperate leader. Her first test as a friend to his people. She looked from the chief's weary eyes to Cheyenne, who stood proudly beside him. Then she looked down at the falcon amulet. It felt heavy in her palm, a symbol of a debt, a promise, and a terrifying responsibility. "I will go," she heard herself say. Providence Gulch was a raw scar on the face of the valley, a chaotic collection of hastily built cabins, tents, and a sprawling saloon, all caked in mud and grime. It smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and avarice. Prospectors, farmers, and men with no discernible trade milled about, their faces a mixture of desperate hope and suspicion. When Eleanor rode in on a horse provided by the chief, with Cheyenne following silently behind, every eye turned to them. She was a lone woman with a native guide. In this part of the country, that was a story that demanded attention. The town's nominal leader was a man named Elias Crawford, a former Union officer with weary eyes and a slumped posture that spoke of past battles and present compromises. He ran the general store and served as the unofficial mayor. "A dam, you say," he mused, stroking his gray beard when Eleanor carefully broached the subject. "Mr. Kane assures us it is for the good of all, a reservoir to see us through the dry seasons. He is a man of vision, ma'am. He is building a future here." Crawford's trust in the newcomer was absolute, his weariness making him blind to any other possibility. That vision was personified by Bartholomew Kane. He was a man dressed in a fine city suit that looked absurdly out of place in the muddy town. His smile was smooth and polished, but his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. He greeted Eleanor with a flourish of courtesy that felt more like a threat. His son, Lyle, was a cruder version of the father, a hulking brute with a firearm on his hip and a sneer on his face. "Do not worry your head about a few savages, ma'am," Lyle said loudly in the saloon. "We will clear these lands of heathens soon enough." Kane saw Eleanor not as a concerned traveler, but as an unexpected complication. He watched her from the window of his newly built office, his fingers drumming a silent, predatory rhythm on the polished wood. He had not accounted for a woman with a spine of steel and a direct line to the Cheyenne. She could be trouble, he murmured to his son. Lyle just laughed. She is just a woman, and he is just one man. What can they do? But Cain was not so sure. He had built his empire on predicting and neutralizing threats, and Eleanor Vance felt like a threat he could not yet measure. Eleanor pressed her case with Crawford, speaking not of treaties or rights, but of shared humanity. Water is life, Mr. Crawford, for all people. Is there not enough in this valley for everyone? But her words were like stones dropped into a deep well. Crawford was a man clinging to the promise of prosperity Cain had sold him. He was afraid to question it, afraid to see the truth. Mr. Cain has invested heavily here, he repeated, his voice weak. He is a businessman, he knows what he is doing. Eleanor realized she could not break through his wall of willful ignorance alone. She needed facts. While Eleanor talked, Cheyenne moved. He was a ghost in the twilight, slipping past the town's noisy saloons and into the shadows of the construction site. What he found confirmed their worst fears. This was no simple dam. It was a fortress. The structure was being reinforced with thick timbers and stone, with clear firing positions built into the upper levels. And the men guarding it were not laborers. They moved with the cold efficiency of hired guns, their eyes constantly scanning the hills. This was not about storing water. It was about controlling it. It was an act of war. Later that night, Cheyenne found something more damning. Hidden beneath a tarp near Cain's office were crates stenciled with the name of the Northern Pacific Railroad. He managed to pry one open. Inside were not tools or supplies, but surveyor's equipment and legal documents. He could not read the words, but he understood the maps. They showed the entire valley, including the settlers' claims, marked for a new rail line. Cain was not building a town. He was clearing the board for a much larger, more profitable game. He was going to betray everyone. Beneath a canopy of brilliant stars, far from the prying eyes of the town, they shared their discoveries. The cold night air was thick with the gravity of their situation. As Cheyenne spoke, Eleanor watched his face, etched with righteous anger and concern, not just for his people, but for the settlers who were being deceived. In that shared moment of purpose, a powerful bond formed between them. It was a connection forged in danger and sealed by mutual respect. It was the quiet beginning of a love that neither of them dared to name. The fate of the valley rested on their shoulders. Cain felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The woman's questions were making the settlers nervous, and he had seen the way she looked at the Cheyenne warrior. They knew something. He could not afford an investigation. He needed to accelerate his plan, to force a crisis that would unite the town behind him in fear and anger. He called his son into his office, the lamp casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. "The time for talk is over, Lyle," Cain said, his voice a low hiss. "We need a catalyst. Bring me the warrior. Make it public. Make it ugly." Lyle and 3 of his hired guns cornered Cheyenne near the livery stable. It was not a fair fight. Cheyenne fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, but he was overwhelmed. They beat him into submission, the sounds of the struggle drawing a crowd. "Spy!" Lyle roared, dragging the bleeding and bound Cheyenne into the center of the muddy street. "We caught him snooping around. He was planning a raid." The lie spread through the crowd like wildfire, igniting the latent fear and prejudice that simmered just beneath the surface of the frontier town. Cain stepped onto the saloon porch, his arms raised for silence. He played the part of the reluctant, stern leader perfectly. "This savage was caught plotting against us," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority. "To protect our homes, our families, we must make an example of him. At dawn, he will hang from that tree as a warning to the rest of his kind. Let them see that Providence Gulch will not be intimidated." He had turned the town into a mob, and Cheyenne was to be the sacrifice that cemented his power. The trap was set. Eleanor watched in horror, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She pushed through the angry crowd to where Crawford stood, his face pale and sweating. "You cannot let this happen, Elias," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "He is innocent. This is what Cain wants. He wants a war." But Crawford's eyes were filled with the terror of the mob. He shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. "It is out of my hands, Eleanor. Cain has the town now." All hope seemed lost. She was alone, her voice drowned out by the rising tide of hatred, and the man she had begun to love was going to die. The dawn was gray and cold. A crude gallows had been fashioned in the town square. Cheyenne stood on a crate, his hands bound, his face bruised but his posture unbroken. He looked out at the silent crowd with an expression not of fear, but of profound contempt. Lyle Cain stood beside him, a coil of rope in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. The entire town had gathered, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and nervous apprehension. The air was thick with tension, a single spark away from an explosion. This was Cain's moment of ultimate victory. Then, a ripple of movement on the surrounding ridges. Silhouetted against the rising sun, dozens of Cheyenne warriors appeared, their forms silent and still. They held their lances and bows, a ring of imminent death encircling the town. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight. Chief Blackhawk sat on his warhorse in the center, a specter of vengeance. Cain smiled. It was perfect. The savages had come for their spy. Now he could justify the slaughter he had planned all along. "You see?" he shouted to the crowd. "They have come to attack us." But before panic could erupt, Eleanor Vance walked into the center of the square. She did not look at Cain or the warriors. She looked at the faces of the settlers, her neighbors. "He is not the one betraying you," she cried, her voice clear and strong. "Bartholomew Cain is the traitor. He plans to take your land, your homes, everything you have worked for, and sell it to the railroad. The dam was never for you. It was to drive the Cheyenne out so he could own this entire valley." Her words hung in the air, a shocking accusation that shattered the morning's grim script. "She is lying. A traitor speaking for heathens," Cain bellowed. But his voice held a new note of panic. Just then, the Old Town doctor, a man respected for his integrity, stepped forward. "She speaks the truth," he said quietly, but his words carried. "I overheard Cain discussing the railroad contracts with his son." A murmur swept through the crowd as the truth began to dawn. Elias Crawford, his face a mask of shame and fury at his own blindness, drew his sidearm. "It is over, Cain," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You are under arrest." The tide had turned. With Cain and his son disarmed and held under guard, the atmosphere in Providence Gulch shifted from confrontation to stunned silence. The imminent threat of violence had been replaced by the raw, uncomfortable truth of betrayal. Chief Blackhawk and a few of his warriors rode slowly into the town, not as invaders, but as witnesses. They stopped before Crawford and Eleanor. For the first time, the leaders of the two peoples looked at each other not across a battle line, but as men who had both been deceived by a common enemy. The real negotiations could now begin. In the days that followed, an agreement was forged, not in a government office, but in the town's humble meeting hall. Eleanor and Cheyenne were the indispensable bridge, translating not just words, but cultures and intentions. The final accord was revolutionary in its simplicity. The dam would be partially dismantled, ensuring a steady flow of water downstream for the Cheyenne. In return, the tribe agreed to a trade pact, providing fresh game and horses in exchange for tools and grain. They established a pact of mutual defense against outlaws and any other external threats. Before he left with his people, Cheyenne met Eleanor by the banks of the Bighorn River, where their story had begun. The winter ice had begun to break, and the water flowed freely once more. "My father says you have the heart of a warrior and the wisdom of a chief," Cheyenne said, his dark eyes full of a deep, unspoken emotion. "You have saved us all." He reached out and gently touched the falcon amulet at her neck. "This will always protect you." It was a farewell. They both knew that their worlds, though touching, could not merge. The chasm was too wide. Eleanor remained on her land, the cabin no longer feeling like a prison of grief, but a sanctuary of purpose. She watched the Cheyenne ride east, a proud and free people. She watched the settlers of Providence Gulch begin the hard work of building a true community, based on the difficult lessons they had learned. The ache of loss in her heart had not vanished, but it was now joined by a quiet strength. She was no longer a ghost. She was Eleanor Vance, the woman who had stood between two worlds and, against all odds, had chosen to build a bridge. Peace, she now knew, was the bravest act of all.